Okay, we're all here again, and we thank you for joining us for our third panel as we discuss the CPSIA's requirement that we go to 100 parts per million lead in children's product unless it is not technologically feasible. So, Rick Woldenberg, would you begin and introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you for having me here today. I'm Rick Woldenberg from Learning Resources. We're a Vernon Hills, Illinois manufacturer of educational materials and educational toys. This is the fifth time that I've appeared before the Commission in a hearing, and I appeared here today at the request of the CPSC. In considering the question before the Commission today, I have to say, since economics have been put to the side, I believe that you've posed a question with no answer, or with an obvious but unwelcome answer. The standard of 100 parts per million looks good on paper, but really does not work in the real world. I think it's appropriate to think back to what we heard this morning. We heard the Consumer Union come out against brass bands. We heard the Association of the Academy of American Pediatricians expressed concern that 2-year-olds would be licking their brother's bicycle. We heard testing companies say that they're ready and willing to test our products, and we even heard one roll out a new product. Some might say that we're facing a conspiracy of neurotics and profiteers. Unfortunately for us in the business community, complying with this new provision is going to involve a tremendous amount of risk, financial risk, that we will have a great deal of difficulty managing. I'd like to say that there's another factor at play here. When Quinn Dodd mentioned that many retailers are now rolling out a 40 parts per million standard to meet the Illinois lead labeling law, he really reminds me of the public fear factor, because the 100 parts per million standard, if endorsed by this commission, will be taken by the general public as an endorsement by the federal government that 100 parts per million constitutes the threshold for safety. And although it is an arbitrary standard, and 2 years ago was 600 parts per million, 3 years ago was nothing, and last year was 300 parts per million, it's currently 300 parts per million, we would have the U.S. government make a public statement essentially that you cannot trust items over 100 parts per million, and that will naturally be interpreted as a health standard. This has already been taken on board in the marketplace. I think that if you recall the U.S. PIRG Trouble in Toyland November 2010 report, you'll see that they have something, quote, examples of toys and children's products containing potentially toxic lead. They managed to find two. The first one was the Princess Expressions Tiara sold at Kmart, which tested out at 87 parts per million lead. And I quote, it says, while this does not violate the CPSI standard for lead and surface coating, scientists have not identified a safe level of lead exposure for children. In other words, anything with lead, even below the standard, can't be trusted, and they feel the right to call that out to the public. They cited a second item for 97 parts per million lead. We're going to be facing that. Unfortunately, I also believe that the folks that are advocating for the 100 parts per million standard are reasoning from the wrong data. When you look at Dana Best's testimony in 2007 to the Bobby Rush Committee, she stated that in considering existing guidelines, it's critical to bear in mind that many were set before research demonstrated the harmful effects of lead at low levels. And then she recited several examples. She cited paint, which is soluble lead, jewelry, which is soluble lead. She cited water, which is soluble lead, dust, which is soluble lead, candies, which is soluble lead, food, which is soluble lead, cosmetics, which is soluble lead, airborne lead, which is soluble lead, and then calls for the banning of all lead, including inaccessible, bound-in lead and substrate lead. It's just not the same thing. They're also using scare tactics where they use the strategy of influence called losses loom larger than gains, where she illustrates that 1 million children might be injured by this, but cannot cite a single example of a child that's been injured by lead and substrate. The absence of known victims is a critical problem with the argument in favor of lead and ban on lead in substrate down to 100 parts per million, because there is no causal link between the products that I make and actual known injuries. And the proponents of this standard have yet to produce evidence that my products, or products made by people like me, have actually injured children. They just assert that they're out there. And the problem with that is that if you cannot measure the harm that's been caused, because they cannot identify injured victims, you likewise cannot identify the benefit that's been gained by changing the standard. Regardless of whether it's cheap or expensive, you can't identify the benefit. But I can tell you what it's going to cost me, and that's a lot of money. Now, the losses in going from 300 parts per million to 100 parts per million are a little different than what we've covered previously this morning, because it's really not an incremental cost in testing. The cost is in waste. The cost is in managing the process. The cost is in shipping delays, rejected lots, penalties, and the like. It exposes people, particularly those who make to order, to tremendous financial risk. I'd like to argue to you that, in fact, 100 parts per million standard is really a 0 parts per million standard. When lead in paint was regulated at 600 parts per million, that standard was intended to induce corporate behavior. If you had lead in paint, your numbers came up much above 600 parts per million. Lead was an ingredient. You poured it in to lead in paint, and so your numbers were much above 600. If you had non-leaded paint, it was much below 600. Your tests never came in at 600. So if you were good and you just never bought leaded paint, you never blew it. It was easy. At 100 parts per million, notwithstanding what we've been told today, in my experience, we're down near the measurable limits. I can give you data. We had 2,701 passing test reports in a 2-year period from 2008 to 2010, and 1.7% of our products came in the range of 100 to 300 parts per million. The problem is I can't tell you which ones in advance. So I have a tightly controlled supply chain. I know what I'm doing. I have the record to back it up. But I can't tell you in advance. I have to check them all to find out which ones come in that range. Every single one in that 1.7 will be a reject. And I'll have to pay for those lots, because your law says that anything over 100 will be not legal to sell and not legal to export. So that means it's just garbage. I'll have to pay for that. Now, if I go and I produce something for my own inventory or for Walmart or for whatever, and it comes in at 101, it's no good. If it comes in at 100, I can sell it. So 100 is safe, 101 is not. What's the difference? 1 part per million. The body does not know which is that 1 part per million, but the extra 1 part per million makes the whole lot garbage. That's a standard of 0. If you have more than 0 parts per million, it's no good, because you've arbitrarily set the deadline, the number around 100. We have taken a piece of string, cut it into 10 pieces. I submitted this with my comment letter on 100 parts per million. You have a copy of this test. We cut it into 10 parts. We tested it 10 times. The numbers came in scattered all over the place, same piece of string, from 239 to 275. We've taken a tape measure. We've taken tape measures from the same lot, tested 3 of them. They've come in between 79 and 97. We've taken the same piece of substrate out of the same lot, same toy, same identical material, tested it 3 times. It's ranged from 23 to 139. 23, 88, 139. If we tested the right one, we pass. If we test the wrong one, we fail. This is a problem for me, because I can't control it. The world is not perfect. It's not utterly and totally homogeneous. Every test is not exactly the same. And every time something goes over 100, I'm going to have to pay. My costs are going to go through the roof. And that's not really in doubt. We've been told by our factories to expect a 10 to 20% cost increase. And quite frankly, I really can't imagine the world where we have to deal with this, so I really can't predict where it's going to all shake out. I do accept that this is not a static world and people will evolve and shift, but we are so low at those standards that this randomness of cost incursion by me is very unlikely to abate, and because it can't be controlled, it could be severe. Please remember that sometimes individual components will fail as well. So if you make up a lot of backpacks and you test a zipper after it's made and the zipper fails, what are you supposed to do? You could test the zippers till the cows come home beforehand, but after you sew them in, if you test the final product and the zipper fails, what am I supposed to do? I have a failing test report. I can't take all the zippers out. I tested the zippers before they were fine. I tested them after they're in. They're bad. Throw out all the backpacks. Should I submit the bill to the CPSC? I mean, let's be realistic here. It has no pattern. We're going to have sharp increases in our component surveillance costs. We expect to lose vendors, and we expect to lose products. Companies are going to go away from this. It's worth noting, since part of what's been discussed here is the projected movement of the market, that in previous hearings, there's been speculation that a market would open up of component manufacturers that would test to meet your standards. That market does not exist. We're 3 years in. So what I'd like to know is, when are they coming? 3 years in, the component manufacturers have not been testing for standards, partly because I don't think they want to be subject to your jurisdiction. So when we project that the market is going to shift and everyone's going to change all these materials to meet the 100 parts per million, I suggest to you that we have data that suggests that that may not happen. But the certainty is that I have to meet the standards. And I just think that that's wholly unrealistic. The 15-month rule, which hangs out there over our head, had some very specific language on what the consequences will be to me of a failed test report. The CPSC, at least as of today, seems to have a great interest in what I do when I get a failed test report, because they think that I presume that the CPSC thinks I'm going to test until I get a passing test report and then call it a day. So the consequences of a single failed test report, many times we don't even control the test reports because third parties can do them, or even our customers can do them. The consequence of a failing test report under the regime that's kind of hanging out there is dramatic. I can't pay those bills. It's not just the bills to the testing company. It's the bills to my factories. It's the bills to the lawyers, because I'm going to have to file my 15B reports and go through all kinds of processes with you. It's the bills to my customers who list my products in their catalog or who promise my products to their customers. I can't handle all this unpredictability. It's just going to all come back on me. So it's an extremely tight standard that leaves me no room to manage the process. And I'd also like to tell you that I think one of the very unfortunate aspects of this is that we're not going to be able to use recycled materials. We sell some products made of recycled materials, and we think we're doing some good by doing that. But quite frankly, you'd be lunatic to sell recycled materials after this. This is a tacit ban on recycled materials because your standard is too tight. And there's no way I can really manage to it. The relationship between these financial risks and the lack of causal link between my products and actual documented, real, live, with photographs, injuries, calls into question, why would we impose all of these risks and costs on the manufacturing community for no particular purpose? I can and I do accept, and it's not worth arguing about, that lead is dangerous. But lead is not dangerous in every manifestation. It's not uranium and it's not germs. If I have lead in my pocket, it's not going to get into your bloodstream. So we know that lead, and not in every case, is a danger to someone else. So we need to think about what are our priorities. The Consumers Union highlighted in several examples vinyl. If the CPSC decides that vinyl is a problem, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that we have to regulate metal grommets. If vinyl's a problem, let's regulate vinyl. If jewelry's a problem, let's regulate jewelry. But just because you conclude that jewelry is a problem, that does not mean that everything that a child ever has is a problem. And I'd like to say one final thing. The absence of a causal link between our products and known injuries is partly because the sources of lead in a child's life is variable and uncontrolled. They breathe it, they eat it, they drink it. They get it when they touch their car, because I'm sure you're aware all of our cars are coated. They are a moving popsicle of leaded paint. So they get lead from lots of different places. They touch the car, they put it in their mouth. But the focus of this legislation is to blame the things that we make. And I think I, as an American company, deserve the right to have it proven that my products are the cause of these asserted conjectural injuries. I'm hoping that the Commission will strongly consider the impact on American manufacturers of tightening the standard and will, in fact, give us relief, which is what we need.
Thank you, Mr. Woldenberg.